We're back with an all-new episode, College Football Playoff Special. An all-new episode of Canzano and Wilner, the podcast. I appreciate everybody who is listening to us. If you're tuned in on YouTube, we're now available on YouTube. We've got a huge guest this week. I'm John Canzano. You can read my work at johncanzano.com. He's John Wilner. You can find him at wilnerhotline.com. John Wilner, we've got Stewart Mandel of The Athletic on this week. He does a podcast with Bruce Feldman called The Audible. It's fantastic. But why Stewart Mandel? Why is he the guy on the college football playoff?
Well, I turn to Stewart when I'm looking for insight into the playoff during the season, in the off season. You know, he's my first read. He wrote a book on the postseason a long time ago, Bowls, Polls, and Tattered Souls, about the bowl system. And he has got great context on not only what we're seeing, but why we're seeing it, what's going on behind the scenes, how the committee, hypocrisies and paradoxes that might be surfacing. He's typically one step ahead when it comes to decoding what's going on with the committee and the playoff seedings and the bracketing. And this playoff is going to change college football like nobody's business. And so I thought, why not get Stewart on, talk about it before the season starts, really, so that we have this for all of our listeners. Listen now, come back in a month, come back in 2 months. What we're going to talk to Stewart about is going to be relevant all the way until the first weekend in December when this whole thing is settled.
Yeah, so much of sports is scheduled, right? And you have the schedule for the games, non-conference games years out. We all know who's playing where. But there is a real unknown about this playoff as it expands to 12. I know there was a lot of frustration, particularly in the group of 5 with the BCS system and others. Then it went to a playoff. Then it went to a 4-team playoff. Now we're getting 12 teams. And I don't think people really know what those conversations are going to be about in November, in October, as these things start to unfold. Who's playing in those games? How will it affect coaching security? And how will it affect the way that star players, approach their own decisions that they have to make at the end of the season with the portal? And do they play in these games? Do they not play in these games? I've got a ton of questions for Stewart. I know you do as well.
Yeah, I do. And before we get going, just so people have it in their heads as we work through our discussion, the 12-team playoff, the top 4 ranked conference champions get automatic bids and will be the top 4 seeds. And then you got 7 at-large teams from the power conferences. And then there's 1 spot reserved for the group of 5. And those 5 through 12 play on-campus games. The higher seed is the host for the opening weekend. The top 4 conference champs get buys into the quarterfinals, which are the traditional New Year's Day bowls. So keep all that stuff in mind as we work through the conversation. But it's I can't wait for this. It's going to be fascinating.
Got a great guest this week, Stewart Mandel of The Athletic. He's got a podcast called The Audible with Bruce Feldman. You can read him at The Athletic. And we're going to talk all about the CFP. Wilner, let's bring Stewart Mandel in. Stewart, thanks for making time, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
You bet.
So we're going to the oracle of the playoff here.
Can we start with just a kind of a retrospective? Like you were there and you were all over the BCS, to the transition to the 2-team playoff, to now, and then a 4-team playoff. Now the expanded 12-team playoff. Is this system getting better, Stewart? Is it getting better fast enough?
Fast enough, huh? I mean, what we're about to see this season was first proposed in the summer of 2021, and everybody thought, oh, this is great. Everybody likes it. No problem. We'll get this off the ground. And then Oklahoma and Texas left for the SEC, and it just tripped the whole thing up, right? It delayed it for over a year. What I say to people is when we went from the BCS to the 4-team playoff, that was because there were genuinely teams that got left out that could have won the national championship. And it was just a really clunky system with computer rankings and everything. And so 4 teams definitely improved on that. But then 4 teams, I think, this move is not about, oh, the wrong team has been winning the national championship. I don't think there's been any year where you felt like that wasn't one of the 4 best teams, but the staleness of seeing the same programs over and over, especially when it was Alabama and Clemson playing each other each year. Ironically, one of the things Greg Sankey brought up when this was first proposed was the fact that the Pac-12 had missed the playoffs so many years in a row, and said that's not healthy for the West Coast not to be represented. Of course, now that's not an issue, but this just something like this needed to happen for the good of the sport, to get more teams and more fan bases invested through the end of the season, instead of there being, it's down to 6 teams fighting for 4 spots and everybody else is playing for a run-of-the-mill bowl game. And I would just also say the effect it had on the bowls, the opt-outs, the fact that, it used to be that making the Rose Bowl was the biggest deal in the world for a Big Ten team, and then Ohio State made it and their best players opted out because they would have rather been in the playoff. So giving the New Year's 6 bowls a playoff game every year obviously restores a lot of significance to those games.
10 years, though, I mean, that's a blink of an eye for the college football postseason when you think about from the bowl. What was the alliance first or the coalition first? I can't even remember.
I get those two mixed up because that
was what, 20 years it seemed like to get to the playoff, and now only 10 years to get to 12. I think going from the BCS to 4 isn't as big a leap forward as going from 4 to 12.
This is just a complete transformation of the entire sport. Like, when have you ever seen any sport, professionally, college, whatever, triple the size of its postseason from one year to the next? Yep. And so the big surprise along the way, John, was like for years, right? Everybody was clamoring for an 8-team playoff, right? Like 4 is not good enough. We need 8. And then when the time came and they did this exploration, they had a subgroup of commissioners that worked on it. They skipped straight from 4 to 12. And it was shocking. I still remember that press release. Ari Fleischer does the CFP media stuff, and classic Ari press release where it's buried in like the 21st graph that they were now considering a 12-team playoff. Shocked all of us. But then once they unveiled it, it was like, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense. This was the rare moment where it did seem like the SEC and the Big Ten already came together to create something that wasn't necessarily in their own best interest, but was in the best interest of the sport. That lasted, 6 months before they were all backstabbing each other again.
Yep.
But, between including the group of 5, that's never happened. And the group of 5, one group of 5 team knows going into the season they're going to compete for the national championship. The way they do rewarding conference champions, I'm sure Greg Sankey would have loved to just say, if the top 4 are 4 SEC teams, then so be it. But agreed to a system where the other conferences also get a first round bye. So it's really, it was the right system at the right time. And I'm sure they will figure out a way to mess that up here in the next contract.
What misconceptions have there been out there as you kind of look at what people are talking about and how fans are examining? What are the questions that keep coming up in your circle?
Well, I just think that even though I've been in the weeds of this for 3 years, most fans are only now getting up to speed on it. And there's going to be a couple real jolts to the system for sure. This is a sport that has always only ever been about the polls and the rankings. And are you number 1? Are you number 3? Are you number 4? The idea of a conference champion guaranteed a berth, no matter what it's ranked, is common in pro sports. Like, we're conditioned to, if you win the NFC East, no matter what your record is, you're going to the playoffs. It's brand new to college football. And I see every time we do a projected bracket or an illustration of it, how dare you have Utah as a top 4 seed and not Georgia or Alabama? And it's like, oh, no, that's not how it works. If Utah wins the Big 12, they're going to be one of those 4 teams, even if they're 10-3. And so I think that's going to be a huge adjustment for people. And I'm sure it's going to be pretty controversial. And then I don't think until we go through it once will people get used to the first round games being on campuses. Like, that is, FCS does that, but we've never done that at the at the highest level. And then of course people ask, well, why don't they do that for the whole playoff? Why are we doing bowl games? But that's a whole other story.
It seems like one of the things that could be controversial, or at least jolting to fans that start to tune in closely in November, is that where you are in the rankings is not going to necessarily correlate to what your seed is, right? I mean,
Right.
when people see that the number 2 team in the SEC, which is ranked 3rd, is seated lower than the champion of the Big 12 that's seated 8th, it's going to cause an outcry.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how people react to that, because the doing this, the rewarding the conference champs, is a direct response to one of the biggest complaints fans had about the old system, that you could win your conference and still get left out, as happened to Florida State last year, or that there were years where Alabama didn't make the SEC title game, but they made the playoff, and people were very frustrated with that. So they're giving them what those people wanted, and I think, to your point, John, like, nobody thought at the time. First of all, we had 5 conferences. We didn't, it wasn't the system that we have now, or the realignment landscape that we have now. And because of that, because of the Big Ten and the SEC consolidating like they have, even though the SEC was the most respected conference for sure for many years, when you said Power 5, it generally meant the same thing for all of them. And so I don't think anybody anticipated that so many of the big programs would go to those 2 conferences, that we could theoretically have a playoff with 4 SEC teams, 3 Big Ten teams, and only 1 from the Big 12 and the ACC. And so, there's that. And also, who's to say that it'll go straight order of records like it always has? Who's to say it won't be 9-3 LSU with 2 top 15 wins gets in, and 10-2 Oklahoma State gets left out because they didn't have as strong a schedule. And that's going to be a huge adjustment, because college football rankings since the beginning of time have always been 0 losses before 1 before 2. Again, unless you were Florida State last year.
The home games in that first round for 5 through 12 playing at home, I kind of think if you're the 4 seed, you might be looking over with a little envy at the end of it. Not that you don't enjoy the bye, but what logistics do you anticipate could be challenging with hosting those games, or is that stuff all being talked about now?
I was at Georgia in the spring, and Kirby Smart said something that was really, that I hadn't thought of. He's like, the worst thing to happen would be to lose in the SEC championship game. He's like, you'd be better off finishing 3rd. And he's right. If you finish 3rd, you get an extra week off before the first round games. If you lose in that game, you got to turn around 2 weeks later, possibly 13 days later. You will get to, I assume the loser of the SEC championship game will be high enough to host a game at least. But these coaches want extra rest. They want, that's a big ask. By the time these guys get to the end of the regular season, if they play a 13th game, they're injured, they're worn down, they have finals that time of year, and they're going to be asked to turn around and play another game. Now, kids are more resilient than I think we give them credit for. But if you're a coach, to your point, like, even though I would assume most years the 5 seed will be favored over the 4 seed because they're a better team. But if you ask the coaches, no, they'd much rather have the bye.
Do you think this will completely dominate the regular season? I just look at the rhythm of college football that we've always known is every Saturday is gigantic. And you get done with the Saturday and you're thinking about conference, the conference races. But it seems to me like starting with Florida State, every week the talk is going to be, what does it mean for the playoff? And is that good? Maybe that's good.
I can only speak for the meetings and the planning that we've had at the Athletic all summer. Yes, we're going all in. We already posted our preseason bubble watch. We are thinking of it as more of an NCAA tournament kind of feel, where all season you're discussing, who might get those last spots, or who's in the best position to win the Big 12 and get that higher seed. It'll be a little trickier though, because it's such a short season. And because of the issue of do you get the bye or not, like, you won't really know who the supposed bubble teams are until you know who lost in the conference championship games, I would think. But that won't keep us from speculating. So yes, I think it'll dominate the conversation, but I don't buy the notion that, well, that means that Saturdays won't matter as much. And to that point, Florida State, that was a great game, down to the wire, big upset for Georgia Tech. Florida State is still very much alive for the playoff. It didn't ruin their season like maybe would have happened in the BCS era, for example. But that didn't change the way I consumed that game and enjoyed that game. And obviously, there's been a lot of taunting of Florida State because of the lawsuit. I just think that's college football. That's not going to change.
I'm thinking about Liberty last year at the end of the season in that bowl game against Oregon, and they were not competitive. The group of five is going to get an automatic berth here in this beta of the playoff for the next couple years. What do those G5 teams need to do to keep that access or keep that automatic access in your mind?
They got to win some of the games. I think it's unfortunate that Liberty became the example because they were the last year. That was by far the worst group of five team that's gotten into the New Year's Six Bowls. They didn't play a soul all season. And for whatever reason, the committee said, well, they're undefeated, so they get in, right? The exact opposite of what they said about Florida State. But you think back to the last several years, those Cincinnati teams were really good. Those UCF teams were really good. They could absolutely have gotten in the playoff and won a game or more. Some of those
Tulane
programs,
beat USC. Yeah.
Tulane beat USC. Yeah. Now, some of those programs have now moved up to the Big 12 or in the SMU's case, the ACC. And that definitely waters down the group of five ranks a little bit. Also, the fact that all their best players now transfer up because of the portal. But I don't think, I think Memphis this year could be a really good team. They're playing at Florida State early in the season, and they'll have a chance to pull that off. Boise State obviously rebounded down the stretch last year, and they're playing several games against Power 5 type programs. You want to count Oregon State and Washington State. So it's kind of like Gonzaga in basketball 20 years ago. They reinvented that whole brand because they got into the tournament and upset people. And that'll be interesting to see if the group of five teams can pull that off.
So could you walk us and the listeners through the threat situation with the group of five losing access, when it could happen, and whether it's the Big Ten and the SEC basically are real serious about cutting them out and the implications for that?
I don't think it's imminent because they just agreed to the new contract with ESPN that'll start in 2026. And all of this is, part of that contract. So I think they'll continue to have that spot through at least the end of that contract, unless they tear it up and start a new one like they did with this. Also, you remember in the BCS days, there was always this threat of antitrust investigations and lawsuits. And I don't think politically, at least as of now, they can get away with saying, we're going to do this is an FBS playoff, but these five conferences are excluded from it. I don't think that would go over well with politicians in those states, whoever else wants to raise the issue. Now, we could obviously at some point see a dramatic transformation of all conferences, not just group of five, but people talk about the Big Ten and SEC breaking away, or the top programs in all those conferences breaking away, and forming something that's completely different than the FBS as we know it. And then a lot of more programs would be affected, obviously. But as long as we have the current conference landscape, I think the group of five is safe having that berth.
I'm thinking a little bit about the SEC and the Big Ten, and we've already seen sort of some jockeying. And I think throughout the season, we're going to hear these coaches and ADs and conference commissioners talk about how great their conferences are and how they deserve four teams in the playoff. And how do you foresee that unfolding? How many teams will the SEC and the Big Ten put in this playoff?
Well, I think it'll vary year to year. I think the SEC, at least going into the season, is going to be very strong and very deep this year because of the quality of the quarterbacks they have coming back, from Carson Beck to Jalen Milroe, Jackson Dart at Ole Miss, Quinn Ewers at Texas. So it would not be surprising if this is a year where they get four teams in, possibly even five teams in, if they kind of dominate in non-conference play and get those big resume wins. I don't know that'll be the case every year, though. And we also just have to see how the committee handles this. Like I said earlier, are they actually, they're supposed to be all about schedule strength. Are they going to, acknowledge that those conferences just play a tougher schedule now than the Big 12 and the ACC, and therefore going 9-3 in that conference is in some cases more impressive than going 10-2 in the Big 12 or ACC. I think they will do that, but I think, the commissioners of those two conferences were disappointed that in this past version of it, Jim Delaney basically wrote the protocol for the selection committee, and it was very much about rewarding conference champions and strength of schedule. And then they got 2 or 3 years into it, and they weren't doing that. the way he had anticipated. So we won't know until we get into this. And I would say more than just one season of seeing how the committee now views these conferences in the new super conference era.
Do you think it's important that for the sport, that they reward the strength of schedule? Because I think if if it's basically the fewest losses are getting in, it's going to scare everybody off for playing tough non-conference games. And, Alabama, Wisconsin this year, USC, LSU, Michigan, Texas, those are important games for the sport in the first half of September. And I think a lot of schools might stop doing that if they feel like they can't get in the playoff with 3 losses.
Yeah, I think you need to reward teams that schedule tough out of conference. That's what the basketball committee does. Yep. Every year, there's a bubble team that gets left out, and their fans are ticked off. And it's like, well, you played the 302nd ranked non-conference schedule. Now, obviously, in that sport, that's a much larger chunk of the season. But you look at Michigan last year; they were the national champions. They earned it, but they didn't play a soul out of conference, and it didn't. All that mattered in the committee's eyes was they were undefeated. As we go forward, yes, you want teams to continue scheduling those games. That, by the way, is Tony Petitti's big selling point. He was the one behind the scenes when you saw reports in the spring that the Big Ten, that there was already discussions about moving it to 14 teams, or that the Big Ten and SEC should have like grandfathered, buys in the first round. That was the rationale they were saying, is that if you leave it in the hands of the committee and they don't treat it the way we're talking about, then our schools are just going to stop playing those games. That's a bit of an idle threat, I think, because you also have these billion-dollar TV deals, and the networks would not be pleased if you stopped playing other power conference opponents. But I think a lot of people will be watching closely this year to see how the committee does. The committee acknowledge that not all Power 4 schedules are created equal.
I'm thinking about the Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, the teams we've seen dominate the playoff and hang around. Do you think we'll get those same teams in the end? Do you see an outlier or two that could be disruptor, a dark horse for this season, maybe?
The biggest draw to the 12-team playoff is that it's going to inject a lot of new blood into the postseason in general. I mean, Iowa State could win the Big 12 this year and go to the playoff, and the biggest deal in the world in the history of that school, right? You could see a lot of that. But I think when it gets to the Final Four, and especially the championship, it's going to be the usual suspects, because it's going to be actually harder, I think, for non-usual suspects. Look at Washington last year, right? They're not a program that recruits top 5 classes, but they had a fantastic quarterback and receivers, and won a very tough conference and made the most of that. But in a expanded playoff, they have to, they beat Texas in the semifinal. They probably would have had to beat somebody like Texas in the round before that, and then do it again, and then do it again. And it's just going to be tougher if you don't have the, waves and waves of 5 stars, especially when you're talking about injuries and who's next in line to win 3, possibly 4 games in the postseason. By the way, the other thing is, what this means is when Alabama has a quote unquote down year, in the past, they go 10-2, they don't make the playoff. They go 10-2 now, they make the playoff, and I don't care how you're still not going to want to play them, right? I think of the peak. What if there had been a 12-team playoff when Pete Carroll was at SC? They might have won 7 national championships, because they were always peaking at the end and they had the best players. But in the BCS, you lose on a Thursday night to Oregon State, and you got left out. So, but I do wonder if people just kind of accept that, because, hey, at least it was decided on the field, right? They didn't get Ohio State, Alabama didn't just get voted into the Final Four. They had to win the games to do it. That's what's really different about this.
All right, a couple quick hitters here. How many can Notre Dame get in with 3 losses, you think, given that they are viewed as an at-large, or is the bar for Notre Dame always going to be 10-2?
I think it's 10-2, and we'll have to see. There might be some years where that's not good enough. Like, if you look at their schedule this year, it's not that great.
It's soft.
This game at A&M, Matt. I mean, the funny thing is they're playing at Georgia Tech. You wouldn't have put that as a significant game before last weekend, but If it's a year where Notre Dame only plays 2 top 25 teams all season and still loses twice, that might push them behind the 4th place SEC team in the chase for an at-large berth. But certainly I don't think they can pull it off with 3 losses, whereas a team that is 10-2 and loses in the conference championship game and is 10-3 with a decent resume, I would think would have a better shot.
Do Washington State and Oregon State being treated as only as at-large teams, they pretty much have to go undefeated, you think?
They remind me of what the situation they're in now reminds me of BYU in 2020, where they were undefeated late into the season and the committee was completely disregarding them because of their schedule. Washington State and Oregon State are now playing a de facto group of 5 schedule. They have a couple more, significant opponents out of conference than those teams usually do, but they're playing 2/3 of their schedule against group of 5 or even FCS teams. So yeah, I think they have to go undefeated, right? Because they're just not going to have the kind of resume that a 1 or 2 loss team would have in a Power 4 conference.
You hit on something there. I think as the playoff rankings came out each week last season, there was always controversy. What do you expect those conversations to be about this year? Late in the year, what are we talking about in October, November? What are fans belly aching about?
Probably the conference comparisons that we're talking about, for one thing, right? Everybody's convinced that ESPN is in the bag for the SEC. And if the first rankings come out and it's like 5 of the top 9 are SEC teams, we'll never hear the end of that. I think where I'll get really noisy is once you get to mid-November-ish, and let's say Oklahoma is pretty much out of making the SEC title game, but they're still very much like they're ranked 11th and they're still in the mix. The kind of debates you have about the 34th team in the basketball, imagine how fierce they're going to be about the last at-large spot in a 12-team playoff. And the thing is, it's going to be teams that aren't that great and have a lot of flaws on their resume. And how do you distinguish between 10-2 Oklahoma and let's say one of their losses to like a 4-8 team, or 10-2 Florida State, or whoever it may be? I mean, I got to think that will be the focal point more so than the top teams, because the top teams will decide it in their conference championship games. Either you'll win and you'll be a top 4 seed, or you won't. But it's going to be much more subjective and frankly kind of arbitrary who gets those last couple spots. If you look at last year's rankings, I mean, I didn't think they got that order right. Nobody cared, but they had I have to go back. Penn State, right, lost the only 2 games of any significance on their schedule last year and would have still made the 12-team playoff. Nobody really cared because it didn't matter last year. If that were this year, that would be a very loud debate.
So tell me what you think of this little theory, which is that we have used, and the commissioners, everybody has used how the playoff looked and how the rankings looked for the last 10 years to project, well, if they had 12 in 2015 or 2018, these schools would have gotten in. But I've always thought that they only had to rank 4. And once they got to 5, they didn't care. Right. So how it looked from 5 to 12 for 10 years isn't necessarily what it would have been from 5 to 12 if there had really been 12 teams getting in. So we've used almost a false barometer to kind of gauge what this thing is going to look like.
Yeah, that, and also just the fact that the conferences aren't the same as they were during those years. So when they were deciding how to divvy up the revenue, right, in this next deal, it was based on how those conferences have performed in the playoff in the past. And so the Big 12 got the least because you take Oklahoma and Texas out of there. There are other teams, TCU, I think, was the only one that won a playoff game. But they were playing Oklahoma and Texas in their schedules. So who's to say if you took them off the schedule that they wouldn't have had more playoff teams, or that some of these SEC teams that made it wouldn't have made it if they had to play Oklahoma and Texas. So it's like data that is no longer all that reliable. And that again plays into I think we just have to get into it and see how the committee treats these teams in this new landscape. I mean, I know this, you look at Georgia's schedule this year, they never played schedules like that during this run. They're playing 3 preseason top 10 teams on the road. They're playing Clemson to open the season at a neutral site. going 10-2 against that schedule, in my opinion, if assuming these teams are about what they're advertised to be, is every bit as impressive, if not more so, than their teams that went 12-0 the last couple of years. But that's going to be a real shock to the system, because in the past you would say, Georgia lost, fire everybody. What a disaster. And 2 losses. Oh no. And it's just, everybody's gonna have to reset what success looks like. I think like the team's records at the top of these conferences aren't going to be as gaudy as they used to be. If the SEC champion goes 11-2, that would be unheard of. But that team might still have 2 top 10 wins and a top 25 non-conference win or so on.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Super Bowl. I mean, the Chiefs win the Super Bowl. That's a 6-loss team that lost to the Raiders in the middle of the season. So I think it's going to feel more like that. And you kind of alluded to that. But what comes next, Stewart? When does it go to 14? Does it go to 16? What changes are you kind of anticipating as this playoff evolves?
I think the Big Ten is pretty clear. They're going to push for a bigger field as soon as possible. They did in the spring. Everybody agreed to table that until after the season. What I have since learned is it was characterized at the time that the Big Ten and SEC were pushing for that. It was really just the Big Ten. But let's say in this first iteration of the playoff, the SEC thinks they should have gotten 4 and they get 3, right? Or something more dramatic than that. Yeah, you could see Greg Sankey turning around and pushing for further expansion. Maybe not next season, but when the new contract kicks in. I mean, it used to be that all these conferences kind of had equal weight in the room, but clearly the Big Ten and SEC are now setting the agenda for the playoff. That's how they got themselves, a sweetheart deal where they're going to make twice the revenue that the other conferences are. So I think if they get 2 years into it and they're like, this field's not big enough, or we should get, that weird idea that they should get the 1 and 2 seeds no matter what, could come back into the picture. And I think that'd be unfortunate, because when they were talking about that in the spring, it was like, you're just going to screw up your system before you even start it. Like you're basically rigging the thing before we even play any games. I don't think that would go over well, but I wouldn't put it past them to keep pushing for it.
It'd be very on brand for college football.
Yes.
And can you walk us through the look-in the new contract and explain what that might mean and when it is?
Yes. Sorry, off the top of my head, I can't remember what year it is, but there is a look in. I want to say
27, 28,
3 years into the new deal,
yeah.
Which Brett Yormark, for one, has been very advocating, because his conference got, left in the dust in this new deal. But it was hard for them to argue otherwise, because, like I said, the teams that are left in that conference have not done well in the playoff. But if they do well to start this thing, if you get 3 years into it and Utah made the Final Four 1 year, and this team, went to then they'll have grounds to say in the look-in, we should be getting a larger split of this. I don't know really. I don't think you have to wait 3. If they all decided tomorrow to change the format, like the number of teams or the buys, I think they can do that at any time. The look-in is more about how the money gets distributed.
Gotcha. Do you think the playoff will change how coaches are viewed in terms of job security, right? I mean, if you're a coach at Georgia, Ohio State, and you miss a playoff in which there are 11 power conference teams getting in, right? Doesn't that get you closer to the firing line than if you miss a 14 playoff?
I could see the SEC becoming just like the NFL, where if you miss the playoff 2 years in a row, you're fired.
Yeah.
Hell, you make the playoff, in the NBA, they can make the conference finals and still get fired. And there's 8, 9 programs in the SEC that think they should be in the playoff every year,
yep,
or every couple years, and that's not going to happen. So, I could definitely see that happening, that mindset setting in that conference. What I don't really have a feel for is some of these programs that are mid-tier programs that probably realistically aren't going to make the playoff all that often, and for whom, I'll use my alma mater as an example, Northwestern, getting to 7 wins and Vegas Bowl, great season for them, right? Like everybody's happy. In the playoff, though, is that viewed as basically like going to the NIT, right? No coach gets rewarded in basketball for going to the NIT every year. So will even a school like that be like, yeah, this isn't good enough. We need to make the playoff every 3 years or something like that.
So does the Motor City Bowl or the Belk Bowl, are they going to just become more irrelevant, you think, with this new playoff?
I think the bowls that have the most to be concerned about right now are the ones that take the teams that are going to just miss the playoff. The Citrus Bowl, the Alamo Bowl, what used to be the Outback Bowl and is now the ReliaQuest Bowl, because those games do depend on ticket sales. The Bahamas Bowl, nobody's buying tickets to that. That is 3.5 hours of programming for ESPN. That they'll be fine. But the Gator Bowl, right? This game that's been around forever and used to sell out the stadium there, and if 20,000 people start going because the teams that are in it thought they were going to be in the playoff, just missed the playoff, that's going to be problematic for their business model. Those are the ones I'm worried about more so than nobody was going to the Quick Lane Bowl in the first place, right? That exists for TV programming.
I have one along those lines, right? So we're watching all these players who opt out of these bowl games and do what's best for themselves, right? Do you think we'll ever see players opting out of playoff games if it expands and saying, I'm a first round pick. I know I am. My team is a big underdog in the first round. I'm going to sit. Or do you think that's safe for now?
I don't know. I mean, we'll just have to. It's a great question. Coaches say, "Oh, that'll never happen." You'd be letting your team down. The NFL would look disfavorably on that. But to this point, the NFL has not looked disfavorably on anybody who's opted out of a bowl game, right? So we'll just have to see if there's that distinction made with the playoff. What I do think they're going to run into is last year in the 4-team playoff, Texas's backup quarterback, Malik Murphy, entered the portal and wasn't with the team in the playoff. The portal deadline is not changing, right? This thing is going to stretch now into January 20th, but the portal window is still the portal window. And if you're a player on a playoff team who is not the star player, but is not happy with your playing time or whatever it is, and you want to, can you really wait until January 20th to enter the portal? You want to be enrolled in your new school and there for spring practice. And that's why we see so much of that movement take place right after Thanksgiving, and the majority of the transfers, I don't have the data, but it happens in the late November to Christmas window. So that's the bigger worry, is you could see teams lose some of their key next tier players who have determined already that they're going to go in the portal, and they don't want to wait to see how their team does in the playoff. Especially
if there's no portal in the spring, right? Which they're talking about.
They're talking about getting rid of the portal window in the spring. And even so, we didn't see, I thought what was going to happen was we would see a big wave of transfers out of Michigan and Alabama and Washington and Arizona, these schools that had a coaching change very late in the game, really too late for a lot of these kids to enter the portal in January. It just didn't happen. Those kids, for the most part, stuck around. So it tells you, if you're got your eye on the portal, which, by the way, is happening around the clock, there'll be guys who, 3 games into the season, if they're doing well, are going to be getting contacted by agents and whatnot about, hey, you should come here next. They're not waiting till November, December to make those plans. So
can you
already know you're going to do it. Yeah.
Can you be in the portal and play in a game? I mean, has anybody explored that? Can you? You
actually could. I mean, if the team, if the coach really wants you to stay, they can hold your spot, right?
Right.
The issue is, I don't think you can enroll at a new school and still play for the old school. So, some of those enrollment deadlines are going to hit right up against the semis and the championship.
Somebody will sue for that, right? I'm sure.
No
so
doubt.
We'll let you go in a sec. What do you think, projecting to the first Saturday, Sunday in December, is the bigger controversy number 4 versus number 5, or is it the last at-large spot?
Probably the last at-large spot.
Okay.
Because those teams' seasons will be over, regular season will be over, their resume is what their resume is, and the lobbying can just go, right, full force.
Yep.
Whereas we don't really know who the 4 seed is going to be until you get through the conference championship games, especially now with no divisions. It's not, the days of Clemson playing 9-3 Pitt in the ACC championship and beating them by 40, right, are gone. So I have to think most of those conference championship games, if not all of them, will be games that you go in not knowing which team's going to win. And so until they do, we don't really know what we're debating between 4 and 5 seed.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we appreciate this. I just think
these are all just theories.
Well, that's okay.
We haven't actually done it yet. So we'll see.
We're going to take this clip, and every single week in the season, we're going to refer back to it. And once the selection show starts, and by the way, selection show, same schedule as always, right?
Oh,
That's
weekly
not
one?
changing.
Yeah, you guys know when the first reveal is?
I do know what it is.
November 5th, when there's absolutely nothing else going on in the country that night.
Yeah. We will be referring back to this every single week because nobody knows this stuff better than you do. And it is just going to be tough for fans to kind of wrap their arms around the issues. And it is going to dominate everything. So we really appreciate you joining us, walking us through this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. Obviously, you know how much I love your work and I love this show. So thanks for having me on. You bet. Thanks, Stewart. Thanks for making time for us.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Good stuff. Wilner, let's decompress here. Let's download on this. Fantastic, informative, made me think about things I hadn't thought about. You know, in real time there, I'm kind of wondering, like, could a player be in the portal and play in the playoff at the same time? I mean, I don't think anything's off the table right now. I'm thinking a lot about the group of 5 teams. Of course, you know, I'm interested in Tulane 2 years ago. Beating USC was fantastic to see in the postseason. Really good team, talented. Liberty a year ago, not so much. But, you know, where's your mind after that conversation?
Well, I think that as much we decided to do this at this point this week with Stewart, right? Because he wrote a book on the postseason, and he knows as much about it as anybody. And we see how big a deal the playoff is going to be. And yet I still think there's a chance that everyone is underestimating how much it is going to consume the season. The Michigan-Ohio State game may not be as important as it used to be because both teams are going to get in, but there's going to be so many games in October and November that weren't important before and are going to become important that it is going to absolutely swallow everything. The playoff is going to be a bigger deal than the conference races. I think it is going to transform the sport like nothing else. Even bigger transformation than going to the 14 playoff a decade ago. So that's what I constantly am thinking about is how this is going to swallow the whole sport, and probably for the better.
Maybe
but it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Maybe, but we haven't done it before. And so I think part of it too is the unknown of it. And, I feel like the BCS system, gosh, we had a Utah team that was undefeated. We had a Boise State team that beat Oklahoma in a fantastic game. We have always had these debates about who should be number 4 or who should be number 5. We're going to be having different conversations this year. And those group of 5 teams, they finally have been thrown the bone that they've been asking for decades. And so let's see what they do with it in this time. I appreciate everybody who is tuned in and watching us on YouTube. If you aren't already, make sure you're subscribed on YouTube. It's a brand new feature that we're doing. And if you are listening to our podcast, make sure you subscribe as well. Share it with friends and family. We'll be back next week with an all new episode.
Thanks so much, everybody.